No, 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 no. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them. Never. Never. That was the training that I had.
All right, that was Alec Baldwin last night in that interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos, as we mentioned. It was an exclusive interview that he broke his silence on to talk about what happened in that horrific event on the set of Rust. Well, as we mentioned before the break, there was no pushback. There was no one there. No one from a firearms perspective, no one from a law enforcement standpoint. I mean, ABC didn't consult any of those people and have them part of that hour-long special that they did. In our opinion, he allowed Stephanopoulos to ask the questions that he didn't have any pushback. So let's bring in those people that should have been part of that interview. The editor of Bearing Arms and Second Amendment advocate Cam Edwards, along with firearms safety trainer and former police sergeant and SWAT team member Marco Galbraith. Gentlemen, good to see you. Mark, I want to start with you. Alex says that he didn't pull the trigger. So the question I have for you is, based on the type of weapon that he had, which is a revolver, is it possible for one of these antique single-action Colt 45 revolvers to go off without pulling the trigger, but just pulling the hammer back?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of things that can make it go off. Is if you pull the hammer back and you don't lock it in place, if you were to pull it back not far enough and let it go, it's going to fall on that primer and the firearm's going to fire. It's a single action revolver, which means you have to physically pull the hammer back to get it to fire. And that
okay, so that being said, and just correct me, but an antique gun like that would or would not have had a safety on it?
They're not going to have a safety on it, no. No, and
okay.
It's got a 3-pound trigger
and if you
pull.
if you were doing basic training on a Colt 45 or any kind of revolver, would you be taught about the action that a hammer has with relation to firing it?
Absolutely. You should be taught that when you cock it back, if you don't bring it back all the way and lock it in place, you can take your thumb off that hammer, and if it falls, it's going to make contact with the primer and the gun's going to go off. You absolutely have to be told that. You've got to be told, don't point at anybody. I do a demonstration with a blank gun, and I put a styrofoam cup over the barrel, and I pull the trigger, and it annihilates that styrofoam cup. So even a blank gun, we have to be very, very careful of. And this, I can't wrap my head around why somebody would have a real firearm and real ammo on the set of a movie.
Well, yeah, we're going to get to some of that. But it was funny because during the show, during the interview rather, he kept doing this motion like he was putting a magazine in. And I'm thinking you weren't using a 9mm or anything like that. You were using a revolver. So clearly it didn't look like he had training on it. Cam, I want to turn to you. In the interview, Baldwin tells Stephanopoulos that the armorer gave him the gun and said it was good to go. So the question that I have is, someone hands you a revolver and says it's good to go, right? And now investigators say there's a .45 caliber bullet inside that. But if Baldwin had opened the revolver up and saw that there were bullets in there, how would he know the difference between a blank and an actual bullet?
Unless he took the bullet out, it probably would have been very difficult for him to know the difference. But it doesn't matter because, as our other guest just said, even a blank can be deadly at close range, which is why the first rule of gun safety is to always treat that firearm as if it is loaded. And we know that while this was a quote-unquote prop gun, it was a real firearm. You always treat that gun as if it's loaded.
Okay, so Cam, he says, hey, when he gets asked about whether or not he's pointing it at her, this is what he had to say. Take a listen.
I said to her, now in this scene, I'm going to cock the gun. And I said, do you want to see that? And she said, yes. So I take the gun and I start to cock the gun. I'm not going to pull the trigger. I said, do you see that? She goes, well, just cheat it down and tilt it down a little bit like that. And I cock the gun. I go, can you see that? Can you see that? Can you see that? And she says, and then I let go of the hammer of the gun and the gun goes off.
All right, Cam, here's the thing. You're a firearms safety instructor. If that's true, right, he says, she told me to do this. So here's a question. I mean, does it really matter? I mean, she's saying, go this way. Shouldn't he say, I'm sorry, you're in the way, I can't fire it at you? And the other question I have is, do you think that she should have had some sort of understanding that there was should she have been part of the training, or should everyone else on the set been part of that training?
Yeah, first of all, I'm not a firearms instructor, but I don't need to be to know that absolutely this should not have happened. Because again, if you're treating the gun as if it's loaded, one of the other cardinal rules of gun safety is don't point your gun at anything you're not willing to destroy. So if they wanted to make sure that shot was set up correctly, you move the monitor to the side so that somebody is not in the line of fire. That is basic gun safety handling. Again, it's inexcusable that this happened here. And as for whether or not people on the set needed basic firearms training, I would argue that anybody in Hollywood who is going to be handling a firearm should have a basic gun safety course, because they're handling firearms. And we can always say, look, it's up to somebody else. It's up to the producer. It's up to the armor. It's up to the assistant armor. It's up to the person holding that gun to ensure that they are safe and responsible with a firearm. And again, getting back to what Alec Baldwin just described, cocking that hammer, and then letting it go. Look, the gun doesn't go off until the firing pin hits the primer in that ammunition. And if it hits the primer and that ammunition with enough force, it's going to go off. If Alec Baldwin didn't have the sense or the knowledge to know that, he should not have been holding that gun in the first place.
That's the interesting thing. Mark, a lot of this conversation when it started after that tragedy, they kept saying it was a prop gun. What is that like? But to lay people, is there really such thing as a prop gun?
There are a lot of them use prop guns, which just make that muzzle flash. They don't make the sound, and the sound is edited in. So, but they're making that muzzle flash, so it goes back to it's probably a blank gun that they're using. But you can't, even in a classroom, in my training classrooms, if you have a real firearm in a classroom setting, you're asking for trouble. The real firearms don't come out until we go to the shooting range in a controlled setting.
So let me ask you this a different way. When they say that they were using a prop gun, which is what their initial statement was, is that a true statement?
No, it's not a true statement. That was not a prop gun. That was a real firearm with real ammo, unfortunately. A prop gun are guns that are made that will not fire a real projectile, a lethal projectile. And they were using, for whatever reason, a real firearm with real ammunition.
Okay, so real quickly, with the 20 seconds I want to give each of you, and I know this is tough, but based on what the circumstances that we know now, where should investigators be looking to find out who is responsible? Cam, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it's likely going to be more than one person. They're going to have to look at the entirety of the chain of custody as to who that had access to that firearm and that ammunition. But again, that would end with Alec Baldwin, and I think the investigation has to include him as well.
Okay, so Marco, let me twist this real quick with you. Baldwin says he doesn't feel any guilt and he's not responsible because he didn't bring the live bullet onto the set. Does him not bringing the bullet absolve him of responsibility?
No, I don't think it will. And I think attorneys are going to be looking at what type of training, if any, did he have with that particular firearm. Even when his interview with George, he referred to putting the clip in. It's a magazine. And it's just a play on words, but he hasn't even been trained in the right verbiage for semi-automatics. So if there's no training, it's going to go back to why wasn't he trained? There's going to be a lot of people involved in this. Lack of training.
That's exactly what he kept trying to make the motion that he was locking a magazine in, and I'm like, you weren't working with a gun, a semi-automatic gun like a 9mm.
Completely different guns. They work completely differently.
Right.
And apparently he doesn't know that. And that's what's dangerous. You don't put
and neither did ABC because they didn't ask any of those questions.
You're right. You're right.
Yep. Cam, Marco, thank you very much. I appreciate you helping break this down for everybody.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate it.
Sean.
You bet. All right, up next.